Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to this launch of the Growth Commission Growth Presidency Memo. You all have a copy of this, I think, on your chairs. Let me tell you a little bit about the Growth Commission. My name is Shanker Singham. I'm the chairman of the Growth Commission. The Growth Commission is a group of 13 independent economists from all over the world. So we have members, some of whom are here today, some of whom are not. They are from the US, the UK, Europe, Japan, Mexico, and India. And our mission and why we were convened is to look at stalled economic growth, primarily in the G7. So we have done quite a lot of work in the UK. We have done some work in Japan. We will do some work in the Eurozone next year. And we're delighted to sort of launch a growth presidency report here in the US. Obviously, we wrote this report before the election. It is intended to be taken by the president-elect and our thoughts and ideas for them. But sort of bear in mind when you read it, it was written before the election. And of course, we need all commissioners to support and agree with the recommendations. So this is a unanimous finding of all of the commission. What I'm going to do is just have a few of my colleagues here who have contributed to the report. We aren't going to do detailed introductions. You can see all of that on the website, and we don't have too much time, so I want to spend most of the time talking to them and not telling you their detailed bios. But what we're going to do is have each of them talk for about 2 or 3 minutes about the areas they contributed significantly to. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then I'll throw it open to questions. And we should be done within the hour. So hopefully we can release you at that time. So I'd like to start by saying just one thing about the structure of the reports that the Commission does and what makes it slightly different from other recommendations that people make. We focus very much on the economic models that we have built. One is a tax and fiscal model that my colleague Steve Entin is primarily responsible for. The other is a distortion model, which is based on the effect of regulatory distortions, market distortions on GDP per capita. And the metric that we are using in terms of understanding economic growth effects is GDP per capita. So our goal is to be able to say to a particular government, if you do the following things, this is the GDP per capita impact that you might have. And equivalently, if you do the following other set of things, this is the GDP per capita loss that you might incur, and thereby to promote better policy making in countries. So without further ado, I'm going to go first to my colleague on my left, Steve Entin, who has led and chaired the Tax Foundation for many years, former Treasury official, and Steve has focused on the tax side of the report. So I'm going to ask Steve to sort of give us the tax highlights just in 3 or 4 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 did a number of things on both the individual and business side of the code. It altered the rates and brackets in the individual income tax. It created a 20% deduction for goods producing pass-through businesses. It raised the standard deduction, the child credit, and the exempt amount on the estate and gift tax. It cut the corporate tax rate to 21%. It extended the full expensing of machinery that was on again, off again for a number of years. It moved the U.S. tax system in the direction of a territorial system with regard to international income, foreign source income. Now, some of these provisions are more related to social policy, and some of them were aimed at economic growth. Some of the growth provisions need to be permanent if they're to be fully effective in stimulating the activities that we desire. Others would have just as much effect if they were extended on a temporary basis and renewed periodically. Except for the corporate cut, which was permanent, the other provisions of the TCJA are being phased out or are subject to expiration at the end of 2026. That was done to comply with the budget process rules. Expiration of provisions of the Act that are most closely associated with growth would slow the growth of the economy. And just to keep it going at current rates, you would have to extend those provisions. If you want to actually increase the growth rate, you would have to go further and remove some of the additional biases in the tax code against saving and investment that still remain. Now, there are problems with the budget process in getting anything done here, as you all well know. TCJA was enacted through budget reconciliation by simple majority vote. Any extension will probably need to use the same method. Reconciliation bills must meet the budget resolution's aggregate revenue floor, spending ceiling, deficit target, and so on, and they can't go beyond the end of the budget window, or they'd be out of order. So if you want to have something permanent in the bill, and we did with the corporate rate cut in the last bill, you have to have some revenue offsets that will be paying for that portion that is permanent, and then you have to let the other things expire. It's important that the budget resolution leave room for sufficient revenue reductions to permit the permanent extension of the most pro-growth provisions of the 2017 Act, particularly those that need permanence to excel, and to cover the adoption of other pro-growth measures that work best if enacted permanently. So as you proceed in this, please take a look at what is necessary and needs to be permanent and what is okay to just keep extending periodically. The Growth Commission recommends permanent adoption of some of the 2017 provisions and the undoing of two economically harmful revenue offsets that were adopted in the 2017 Act. These measures include permanent extension of the expensing of machinery, the restoration of expensing of R&D, and the full deductibility of business interest. We also recommend extension. The extension of expensing is really the key one, but there are other forms of expensing, such as the R&D extension. We would also like to see an extension of expensing in one form or another from machinery sector to include something for structures. Structures are 2/3 of the private capital stock. Machinery is only 1/3. It's 2/3 of investment because it keeps wearing out fast. You keep having to replace it. The buildings are the biggest chunk of the capital stock, buildings and infrastructure. A combination of all of these elements, or some of them anyway, could increase the capital stock and labor productivity, which drives up wages, which drives up employment. And we would expect per capita income to be rising to roughly 2 to 2.2% long term. Most of the increase would be felt within a decade, with more coming over the next several years as more structures are completed. In 2024 dollars, we would expect per capita income to rise between $2,700 and $3,100 if you're going to include structures in the incentives, or between $1,000 and $1,300 without the changes to the structures. These are significant numbers, particularly if you have a big family. The expensing provisions are key to boosting the investment. Yet they're about the cheapest things you can do because it's mostly a time shift in when you take the write-off. And once all the old stuff is out of the system and you're just expensing everything new, you're about back to where you would have been under depreciation, except the timing difference means a lot to business because they have a fairly high borrowing rate and they need to have a rate of return that will cover their costs in present value, discounted to the present. And just shifting the time makes a lot of difference in how much capital can be formed, how much they will say is productive enough to invest in, and it really, at very little expense long-term to the government, gives the economy a very large boost. Much of this is presented in terms of which policies give you the most bang for the revenue buck, and expensing is right there at the top of the list. More important, I think, in view of the current climate, as people are worrying about this or that, such as manufacturing and international competitiveness and what's going on with trade, If we do the right thing on the tax side for the business community, we're going to lower the cost of plant and equipment. It's going to make the United States a much more attractive place in which to invest, in which to produce for sale abroad, and in which to produce for sale here at home. Whatever we manage to do on the trade negotiations and more free trade zones, or whatever the tariff deduction plays out to be, having taken away some of this tax bias against saving and investment will really carry a lot of the load. And we should bear that in mind. All these things are connected. The tax side is connected to the trade side, and so on. The report goes into detail on revenue estimates relating to the provisions. I'll let you look at that. The distinction between the static estimate, assuming it does nothing to improve growth, and the dynamic estimate, which takes the reduction in the cost of plant and equipment and projects the increase in investment and employment, the dynamic estimate, are quite different. Several of the provisions I listed convert from a net revenue loss to a net revenue gain within the budget window if you take account of the dynamic feedback. And some of the other provisions, such as the corporate rate reduction and the restoration of the deductibility of interest, recapture some 40 to 45% of their revenue loss by taking into account the dynamic revenue gains. So in the budget process, we're not asking Congress to throw out the static estimates that they've been using for 100 years, or however long they've been adding things up. And we're not asking them to get rid of the static estimate, but we are asking them to think about the dynamics and to take what is reasonable to expect in the way of revenue reflow and set that revenue target down enough such that when we get the reflow, it comes back up to where they think it ought to be. You don't have to totally overthrow the revenue estimation techniques on the Hill, which would make some of the people on the Hill very uncomfortable. But if you just take it into account, set your targets, and get enough spending offsets or other revenue changes to pay for what needs to be permanent, and then just let the other stuff get renewed over time, you could really achieve these growth objectives without any real strain, particularly if you compare it to some of the bills we've had recently, such as the COVID relief and the Inflation Reduction Act, which threw trillions of dollars around. You can get a very good bill going for a much lower price than that will yield a far bigger increase in per capita GDP and output and help us solve some of our trade issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. So that's the start of the report talks about the tax and fiscal position. The structure of all of Growth Commission reports is to look at the tax and fiscal position of the country, to make recommendations in the tax area, and then to look at the regulatory area and some of the other things that we are talking about in the report. The GDP per capita gains that are possible from the tax area that Steve talked about are significant, and we're talking over the next 10 years of the order of 4 or 5% of GDP per capita gain for tax. Our models demonstrate and show that some of the biggest gains that we can make are in the area of regulatory reform, and that is not intuitive. Most people sort of assume that tax is where the biggest gains come from, and regulation is a sort of nice to have. Our models suggest that's not correct, and in fact the gains from regulatory reform are very high, and we'll talk a bit more about what they are after we've heard about some of the recommendations that we make in the regulatory space. So I'm going to turn to Alden Abbott, who is one of our commissioners who focuses on domestic regulation and competition, in particular as former General Counsel of the Federal Trade Commission, and a colleague of mine who I've worked with for probably about 25 years. So over to you, Alden, on regulation.
Thank you very much, Shanker. So our report have a chapter begins to focus on studies that document the excessive costs of regulation. Obviously, it's understood that there may be market failures where regulation is needed, but more and more research indicates that regulation greatly exceeds what is needed to deal with market failures, even assuming government can do a good job of doing that. Now, as far back, starting in the 1970s up to about 2010-12, there started to be a lot of empirical studies on the costs of regulation. OECD wrote in 2012 that the literature on regulatory policy and governance in general seems to confirm that poorly designed regulation can stifle economic activities and ultimately reduce economic growth. Our report talks about lots of different specific studies, but I really want to highlight two broad pieces of testimony given by Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former chief economist and then director, actually, of the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, and by Casey Mulligan, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and in the last Trump administration was a chief staff economist for the Council of Economic Advisors. Now, in May 2023 testimony, Holtz-Eakin noted that GDP per capita in the U.S., after rising 2.3% annually in the second half of the 20th century, had risen at what he called an anemic rate of 1.2% thus far in the 21st century. And regulation is one of the culprits. He found that from 2005 to today, agencies have recorded cumulative costs of $1.5 trillion in regulatory costs and approximately 1.3 billion annual hours of paperwork and imposed over the past 18 and a half years. That would represent roughly 6% of current US GDP, he wrote. And summarizing studies, a variety of studies, he said, regulation imposes costs on firms which compete with opportunities for innovation, capital investment, worker training, and productivity growth. At present, new regulations also represent an additional supply shock that exacerbates inflation pressures. And he touted a potential regulatory budget that involves a mechanism by which agencies develop regulatory actions that balance out or exceed new regulatory actions, deregulatory actions that exceed regulatory actions, and establish cost or savings goals across a given agency and the federal government writ large. Now, President Trump did start the process in his first term of a sort of regulatory budget that was discontinued under President Biden. Now, Professor Casey Mulligan did a study of the costs on families, trying to look at the dollar costs, not on specific families, but basically how had added regulatory costs, how could it be measured as burdens on families? He did present value costs. You know, for those of you who aren't economists, present values, you look at certain actions. You trace their effects into the future, 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 years, and discount that by an appropriate discount rate, interest rate, and sum up because the costs are less, future costs are less significant than current costs. So you sum all that up and you get something called present value. Now, Mulligan found that through 2022, the Biden administration had added regulatory costs of $617 billion per year based on rulemakings alone, or $5,000 per household per year for rules finalized in 2021-22, and he added that continuation of the 2021-2022 pace for 8 more years would yield an aggregate per household regulatory burden, again in present value terms, of over $40,000. In contrast, he estimated that application of President Trump's deregulatory approach, as opposed to President Biden's regulatory approach over 8 years, would have yielded aggregate savings, again, present value terms, of up to $80,000 per household. There are a variety of other studies, but let me just summarize some general comments about indicating that excessive regulations slow down productivity gains. And why would that be? Well, economic analysis demonstrates that a rise in the productivity of inputs spurs economic growth, faster economic growth, the benefit of workers, consumers, and aggregate economic output. Moreover, as productivity increases, wages can be raised without corresponding increases in producers' unit labor costs. That means it's a finding that a reduction in regulatory burdens raises productivity. That supports the proposition that regulatory reform enhances economic growth and per capita GDP growth. There's a study of the telecoms industry, an old study at this point, 1996, but that describes that process. Now, anti-competitive market distortions referred to by Shanker Singham. In the last couple of decades, he, Srini Rangan, other colleagues, including Christine McDaniel here, have undertaken work on economic harm caused by anti-competitive distortions. What do we mean by this? These are these are actions that involve government actions that empower certain private interests to obtain or retain artificial competitive advantages over their rivals, be they foreign or domestic. And there's a whole political economy about regulation that suggests lots of regulations are established at the behest of large politically connected companies precisely because they distort regulation by benefiting the incumbent firm, even if it bears cost, by excluding or harming rivals to a greater extent. So that can have huge distortive effects. I think more will be said. The studies by Shanker Singham and his colleagues find huge anti-competitive market distortion costs and suggests that he's done a study of India, and it's beyond our scope, but more will be said. So what reforms do we suggest? One, adoption of a regulatory budget, which President Trump tried to do before. Second, recalibrating regulatory cost-benefit analysis to make it more effective in identifying the burdens of regulatory proposals. And three, establishing a process for identifying anti-competitive market distortions and a regulatory review process so they can be avoided and ideally eventually phased out. And before closing, I would just mention that the Biden administration made some changes in advisory advice given to agencies, and also a new executive order that suggested that cost-benefit analysis, which still theoretically is applied to new major proposed federal regulations, can take into account qualitative factors, quality of life factors, and other things which cannot be measured. And that it really, I think some of us believe, this opens up sort of the possibility for allowing almost any regulation to pass cost-benefit muster if the administration wants it to. It's sort of in tension, I would argue, with the rule of law. It's very problematic. But I will quit at this point and turn back to Shanker.
Thank you, Alden. And what we'd like you to see is the scale of these numbers. That we're talking about very big numbers in terms of the impact of regulatory reform. I'll come back to you on some of the recommendations in a second. But before I do, I'm going to now turn to Barbara Bowie-Whitman, who I first met in the battles over the free trade area of the Americas in the 1990s, when she was in the State Department coordinating trade policy. And so I'm just going to ask Barbara to say a few words, and then I'll have a few questions for our panelists.
Thank you, Shanker, and I'm glad to see you all. As economists, we know that open trade increases growth. And we also know that tariffs can be a very blunt instrument. It can cut growth and raise prices of inputs to manufacturers and of final prices that consumers pay. And that is why we're recommending that the new administration fine-tune that blunt tariff instrument to assure that it can hit its intended mark without the frustrations of unintended results. In the mid-'70s, as an economic member of the National Security Council staff, I wrote decision memoranda for President Ford on trade remedy cases. Our trade remedies need an update nearly 50 years later. In the 1990s, as Shanker just said, we met on the lecture circuit during debates over adopting NAFTA and working on the free trade area of the Americas. For a couple of decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, many other countries embraced free markets and a Washington consensus which looked to unite their markets with ours in more open trade. After all, the Soviet economic model had failed, so they might as well try the free market. One major economy, we know who it is, did not reject that failed model, but took advantage of the good faith of others in the world trading system. Our policy tools for addressing their anti-competitive market practices need an update in the face of these distortions that they have produced. The memoranda I prepared for President Ford involves Section 301 tariffs. We have seen that these 301 tariffs on Chinese imports under the 45th and the 46th presidents were less effective than President Trump's use of Section 232 tariffs on imported autos, which, by the way, helped the U.S. regain agricultural market access to Japan after we left the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's undeniable that international trade and investment have been key channels for U.S. productivity growth over decades. The incoming administration needs to find the ways to address unfair trading practices of partners without harming our household incomes. One means to do it would be to identify market distortions and act only on those distortions. That would require identifying market distortions in a targeted and scientific way, which would allow supply chains to go ahead and incorporate Chinese or other country content which is not subject to an anti-competitive market distortion, but would apply a tariff where anti-competitive distortions can be shown. The tool we suggest would allow damaged producers to assert a distortion in an exporting country's market, but they would be required to prove that the distortion damaged competition to a quantifiable degree. In these cases, a tariff or another appropriate measure commensurate with the harm could be granted. The measures would differ from just existing anti-dumping and countervailing duties by focusing on the anti-competitive effect of the distortion in a relevant product or geographic market. Using this approach would enable us to be more open to undistorted products and allow us to signal that undistorted products are welcome, but we have a robust defensive tool to deal with distortion. Our Growth Commission models confirm that domestic competition, intellectual property rights, and international trade openness are all highly correlated with GDP per capita. Now, though the temptation to use tariffs as a blunt instrument is great, the cost of overly broad tariffs passed through to producers and consumers negatively offsets economic growth stimulated by appropriate tax and regulatory policies. We believe the U.S. should maintain trade openness in the general case and develop a narrowly targeted, evidence-based tool to defend against anti-competitive measures by other countries. We also believe that the U.S. should embrace a foreign market opening trade agenda, including agreements with key allies, such as the U.K., possibly by having them accede or dock onto the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Now, just as China considers its Belt and Road Initiative to be a trade initiative, the U.S. should be looking toward prosperity zones that can be developed in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Doing so could counter the increasing power of Chinese state-owned enterprises in those regions. Another idea would be to include a chapter on market distortions in our trade agreements and discussions, and to make this a condition for acceding to the USMCA. This would require countries to eliminate market distortions in their own economies and apply the FTA dispute settlement mechanism to address any that might arise. It would allow the signatories to the FTA to enact domestic measures to deal with any such distortions. Finally, we really have to emphasize that a country's trade openness contributes strongly to GDP per capita. Our model suggests that a 15% increase in trade openness correlates to up to 7.6% per capita increase in GDP over the time it takes to implement that opening. And such a GDP per capita effect cannot be overlooked.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm going to come back now to First of all, I'm going to ask Alden a couple of questions. Just building on what we talked about before, this sort of hidden cost of regulation. So everyone focuses on the red tape, the burdensome nature. It would seem that focusing on the effect of regulation on competition is going to pick up most or a lot of that GDP per capita gain that Christine was talking about in terms of domestic competition. How should we approach this issue in the context of cost-benefit analysis, regulatory reform? What kind of cost-benefit analysis should we be doing?
Well, I think we really need to change the way its cost-benefit analysis is actually carried out. There have been executive orders on the books since the Reagan administration. In fact, even before that, essentially asking agencies to carry out cost-benefit analysis of major proposed rules. There's also something called a Paperwork Reduction Act, which focused a lot on the paperwork costs of carrying out certain government mandates through regulations. And I think the point has been made that really misses the mark because regulations, their big effect, sure, there's some hours in filling out regulatory forms or changing business systems because regulations differ in one country as to another country. But the real things are these huge distortions. Regulations require companies, for instance, to abandon use of fossil fuels, to change the inputs they use, totally distorts their business plan. And in many cases, as was suggested, regulations really are often shaped in a way through public comments and so on that really benefit incumbent firms and increase market power of those firms. And interestingly, there's a study by Singham, an economist, did a machine learning study at Goethe University that looked at the impact of federal regulation on market power increases. This is about a couple of years old, and it goes back to our conversation again about incumbents using their influence. It estimated that up to 37% of market power increases could be explained by federal regulation, which might seem counterintuitive, but in effect, lots of the mergers and other competitive actions that are looked at in private or government antitrust actions have effects 2 to 3% price increases, something like that. So this is huge. And Professor Mulligan, we did a podcast with him in September. Shanker and I, in fact, if you type in on the search engine Mulligan, Singham, Abbott, and Mercatus, M-E-R-C-A-T-U-S, where we are, you can get the transcript or recording. He thinks that's a very low number based on his studies. And for instance, just one example of the cost of regulation is one regulation that was enacted when he was at Council of Economic Advisors dealing with a price control rule on business-to-business transactions in pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs. He said, who really wanted it? Manufacturers wanted it to limit the discounts that would be received by their customers. But the estimates of its cost really on paperwork, on really ministerial accounting things were $50 million. He estimated the real cost was $100 billion with a B dollars. So that again suggests, and he thinks this is very typical, you look at major regulatory programs. So really cost-benefit analysis should be reworked, and a new emphasis needs to be placed on looking at anti-competitive market distortions. How could you do that? There are already methodologies, discussion already by Shanker and by Christine McDaniel. There are ways in which you can make estimates, and indeed Mulligan poo-pooed the idea that, well, they say, oh, it's too difficult to do. And he said, no, in some cases I did quick and dirty. They don't have to be perfect estimates using economic logic and so on that found that the original estimates of costs by an agency were just that the real costs were several orders of magnitude higher. And he thinks this can be done. You could have the Congressional Budget Office, a new type of office dedicated to doing estimates, and you could get economists working on that. We recommend, by the way, potential executive orders that could be useful in dealing with this sort of issue. For example, in order by the president to recalibrate regulatory cost-benefit analysis, and to establish a process within the bureaucracy for identifying ACMDs in the regulatory review process, anti-competitive market distortions, so they can be avoided and ideally phased out. And actually, perhaps serendipitously, now there's this new sort of government efficiency department, which is to have a life of 1.5 years with Elon Musk as co-chair. I mean, that sort of recommendation, I would think, might be of great interest if the real focus seems to be on reducing excess costs of government regulatory activity.
Thank you. And just to be clear, so with cost-benefit analysis, the value of cost-benefit analysis is to allow policymakers to say, look, this is the cost. If you're going to follow a particular regulatory pathway, that's totally legitimate to do. But you should at least try to do it in the least damaging way to trade, damaging way to competition, to these three pillars that Christine talked about. And there may be cases where you're going to do it anyway. You decide that it's just so important, the regulatory objective is so important, you're going to do it anyway. But it's very important that the public understand the cost of what it is you're doing, and that if alternatives exist that are less costly, they should of course be estimated. But you can't really do that unless you have a real robust sense of the cost. And that brings me to Steve with a question you mentioned in your opening remarks about the difficulty of incorporating dynamic effects into analysis. I think one thing the Growth Commission kind of prides itself on is our focus on dynamic effects and our focus on how that is translated through an economy. Could you talk a little bit more about that in the context of tax and fiscal issues?
Thank you. As you read through the document, you're going to see some frequent references to the Tax Foundation General Equilibrium Model, which is the best source in town for getting the difference between a static and a dynamic revenue source. They go through almost every one of these provisions. They have current provisions, they have provisions from previous tax bills, and they explain all of this business about static and dynamic in some of the best and most understandable English that I've ever had the privilege of looking at. The staff is very good at that and always willing to help. So by all means, do use them for further reading on this. For many, many years, the budget process simply took an economic projection, changed the taxes or changed the tax base, whatever rule they were changing, and just took the change and applied it to the same economy, as if these things had no effect whatsoever on people's behavior, on the level of employment, the size of the capital stock, or the height of the wage. Arguments against this fell on deaf ears. We don't need that. We don't make so much big changes. We can't choose between one economist's estimate of it and another economist's estimate of it. We have the Keynesian theory. We have the monetarist theory. Can't do it. And the data doesn't exist on it. Well, some years back, a former Treasury official, Gary Robbins, and also former Treasury official, Norm Ture, sat down and they decided they were going to try and get the database in order. They went through the Fed, the Commerce Department, the Labor Department, all kinds of data. And they put it in order as to how the various activities were treated for tax purposes. They didn't just look at the corporate sector. They separated the S corporations that are pass-throughs from the C corporations that are taxed in two different places, on the corporation and on the shareholder. They took the Federal Reserve out of the private sector. Thank you very much. It's a corporation technically, but it's government. And they straightened this all out. And they really had to do a lot of it. It took years. Now, they weren't doing this alone. Dale Jorgensen at Harvard, who became chairman of the department, wrote a trilogy that thick on capital theory and how businesses decide to invest or not invest. And the mirror image of that in a sort of economy-wide equation is what went into what became the tax foundation model. To justify putting up a building or buying a machine, you have to earn something like a 3.5% real risk-adjusted rate of return after tax. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Well, so you add back in the risk factor you need, you add the basic return you need, you add the inflation in, and then you point out that this is all taxable, and up you go, and you need this return in order to do the machine. It's called the service price. Calculating service prices for 15,000 different kinds of capital, which is what we have in the model, and calculating it for the structures, and figuring out how a rate change or a base change or a phase-in or a phase-out is going to affect that service price, we can determine whether a particular tax change is going to increase or decrease the supply of capital, increase or decrease the labor productivity, increase or decrease the wage, increase or decrease in employment. And when you have the new economic forecast, you can apply the new law to the new forecast and get a better revenue estimate. It's a lot of work. Can't be done, can't be done, don't need it. Well, when we began doing it and publishing the results, obviously it could be done. It took people a while to catch up. But when some other think tanks began trying to do the same thing, all of a sudden it wasn't the business-oriented tax foundations all out on a limb over there. It's the nonpartisan tax foundation and the AI and the Brookings people are now doing some dynamic taxation. So now we're nonpartisan because other people are doing it too. Okay, that was a good laugh that morning. Anyway, but this is how you do it. You don't just say, all right, we're giving people money to spend, and on average they'll spend it 3 times, and you get a multiplier of 3. We know that doesn't work. If the government's going to hand out $1 billion here, but then it has to borrow it back over there, there's no gift to put into the multiplier. Milton Friedman pointed this out 40 years ago, 50 years ago, a long time ago. Only if the Fed buys the debt do you get added demand. And if you do that and output hasn't gone up because you haven't changed the labor force or the capital stock, all you get is the price hike. But if you do these other things that make it more attractive to work, make it cheaper to buy plant and equipment, you get more labor, you get more capital, guess what? You get more output. People are paid for producing the output. Their income went up and the stuff that's available for them to buy went up. It's not inflationary. It all balances out. Supply and demand go up together or they go down together. All the rest of the kerfluffle, the interest rates, stimulus, multipliers, it's not how the world works. So we're using the best current understanding of how things work in the tax foundation model, and some of the other people are trying to do the same thing. And we're getting results which, if you go through the literature on the tax foundation website or elsewhere, you will find that this type of tax works, that type of tax doesn't, this type simply redistributes income, that kind of tax change either increases it or decreases it. And you can pick and choose, and you can do the things that work the best for the lowest cost and get the biggest bang for the buck as soon as possible. And that's what we hope you'll do. Thank you.
One of the reasons we use national security tools to deal with economic problems is because the economic tools that we have are insufficient. And this is where we talk about the distortions and the tarification of distortions. We could go back in a time machine to when in the early 90s economies were opening up, and we could have said that we will open up consistent with competition and internal competition within markets. We didn't, and so that is why we're having a tariff conversation now. So this idea of tarification of distortions with respect to China is an economic tool that might be useful. Could you just talk very quickly about the idea of working with allies, bringing together our partners who will have similar approaches to these problems and creating a sort of grouping of countries that will sort of promote some of the things we're talking about today?
That brings me back to how you and I met when we were looking at larger associations of what could have been 34 countries in one agreement in this hemisphere. But what we have learned over a lot of experience is that when we do get a group of countries together that can reach some reasonable conclusions on how they do business and what levels of openness they want among themselves, And if a group of countries then later says, okay, together we are facing a challenge of someone not in our group who is trying to do some things that definitely distort the markets, when we act together, the cost upon us of applying those tariffs will be less when we work with others. Now, sadly enough, the thing he and I were talking about years ago never came to pass for a lot of reasons. And this is not within the scope of this report, but it's just a little observation, which is that one of the reasons we never got the 34 countries together is that some of them still relied principally on tariffs for financing their governments. And therefore, they weren't willing to give it up. Also, another general observation, as free market economists, generally you don't necessarily want to have agreements between governments because governments have always intervened in how we handle trade. It's there. But working together with some of our close allies, where we come to common terms on how we reduce the barriers among that group or between two countries, gives us a basis for working together to deal with the distortions that outside parties bring into our trading system.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to close it there because we're sort of running very late, but thank you very much for coming. Do pick up the report. One thing do look out for with the Growth Commissioners, we are putting together an international advisory board, which we'll announce very shortly, of former leaders, former prime ministers and presidents of countries, mainly in that G7 grouping. So that'll be published very, very shortly. And please join me in thanking the panelists in the usual.